Well, good evening, everybody. I think it's just past 7:30, so I should probably make a start to this second talk of the autumn term. First thing to say, great news as far as I'm concerned. I had my first proper live rehearsal last night, and I'll tell you a little bit about it, not to bore you, but just you might be interested in how we did it and how it worked. Basically, this was with the Ockham Singers, and we had 29 singers in a fairly large rehearsal space, but not particularly big. But it was enough space so that everybody could be round the edge of the room, so nobody was singing in front of anybody or nobody singing behind anybody. Obviously, they were socially distanced. We had to clean the whole place beforehand, so it was officially designated as a COVID secure space. And we had to clean everything afterwards as well, but that wasn't too onerous at all. As I say, we had 29 singers plus me. Everybody stood up in their little space, so there were no chairs to have to wipe down and all that kind of thing. And everybody, this was the major factor, everybody wore a mask for the entire occasion. One or two people had visors, but most people wore a mask. And I know one might think that that's terrible and that's going to be impossible to sing, but on the whole, we found it was awkward at first and a little bit annoying, but perfectly doable. It's like anything, isn't it? Once you get used to it, it wasn't so bad. And we sang music by Mozart and Purcell and William Byrd, so mostly unaccompanied repertoire. But the really exciting part of it was the fact that everybody who was there absolutely loved it and can't wait to repeat the idea next week. And above all, I think what was quite special about it was the fact that everybody was listening like crazy. Whilst they couldn't perhaps sing as lustily and with quite the same energy as they perhaps would normally, everybody was listening, because it was that sheer feeling of having other voices around the room working together in real time, in real space, without any electronics, and just using our ears and the natural ambience of the room. That was so fabulous that actually things like intonation and ensemble were better than I remember for a long time, if ever, because everybody was so focused and so enjoying the fact that they could actually hear each other. So that was very exciting. And hopefully it shows, I know other choirs have done this as well. And in spite of everything that's going on, it does show that it can be done, and hopefully, touch wood, it can be done safely. And I would say also that we made a point of just having 1 hour and I think 10 minutes, something like that, no break, and everybody came in separately, everybody dispersed separately. So there was no mingling, there was no real socializing. It was just a really enjoyable time. And as I say, everybody loved it. And I found it absolutely amazing to be back after 6 months, just over 6 months from the last time I heard live music with people of that sort. So that was absolutely brilliant. And I hope it just shows that it won't be too long before we can do something similar. I should point out, just for the record, that some members of the choir decided they weren't going to risk it. And it wasn't just the older people, some of the younger ones, particularly those who work in schools, felt that they owed it to their schools and to their classes and their pupils that they shouldn't put themselves at any kind of additional risk that they didn't have to, which they could then spread to their young people. So some people took that view, which was entirely understandable, and they didn't come. But what we did do is we recorded the whole event, and it'll be sent out to those who missed it, so they can at least hear what we got up to and not feel, hopefully, that they've missed out too much. So That was great. Today, I thought I would start to talk about and introduce the wonderful Speminalium by Thomas Tallis, which, as you know, we are discussing the possibilities of doing some work with, doing a sort of project with, or based around this piece. And I thought it would be useful just to say a little bit about it. Speminalium is one of those pieces that most people have heard of, but many of us don't know much about it, and even fewer of us have even heard it live, let alone taken part in a performance. And I have to hold my hand up here myself. I have performed it once, but it was a long time ago, and all I remember, it was a bit of a disaster. It wasn't one of the most riveting performances of anything that I was singing, I should add. Would you believe I do sometimes sing, or did? So yes, I was singing in one of the choirs. I can't remember which one. I think it was choir 7. But that's my only real experience of the piece. And of course, one of the reasons why nobody knows much about it is because just that, nobody knows much about this piece. And indeed, nobody knows much about Thomas Tallis, really, and rather sadly. So I will try and fill in a little bit of information that we do have, and hopefully that'll at least help to put it into context. The first thing to say about Thomas Tallis is that he is one of the very famous group of British, English, perhaps I should say, composers of the Renaissance period who lived just before and after 1600. So these names include people like the 3 Thomases: Thomas Wilkes, Thomas Morley, Thomas Tomkins, William Byrd, the wonderful and great William Byrd, and also Thomas Tallis, of course, was one of that group and is often grouped together. But one of the things that separates Tallis is the fact that he was actually a little bit older than the others. And he was born, we don't know exactly when he was born. Here's another problem that we have, but we think it was around 1505, something like that. And he definitely died in 1585. So he had a good old life, good old innings, but he was kind of 35 to 40 years older than people like William Byrd and the Thomases, and of course the wonderfully named Orlando Gibbons, who is another of the composers of that period. So although we tend to lump them all together, that's really a gross simplification, because they are very different. They're different people. They were often living at slightly different times. But Tallis and Byrd do tend to go together, even though they were separated by 35 years or so. They still had quite a major overlap. And as I'll explain later, there is definitely quite a close connection between the two. What else can I tell you about Tallis? Well, as I say, we don't know much about his early life, but we do know that he was working as an organist at the Dover Priory in, I think it was 1531, and he also had a time working at Waltham Abbey in Essex shortly after that. But then he became a gentleman of the Chapel Royal. And once he became a gentleman of the Chapel Royal, that was kind of your passport for the rest of your career. It simply meant you were a singer, basically. The Chapel Royal had a professional full-time choir. You were paid as part of the royal household, and your job was to sing, and in some cases to write music for the chapel choir. So that's what Tallis ended up doing for the rest of his life. And I guess quite a nice job to have. But the complications with Tallis, and indeed all the Renaissance composers of this period, of course, is that they lived through and just past the Reformation. And this caused, as we know, such a major upset, both in the fabric of the nation, in the politics of the nation, and of course, most particularly in the religion of the nation. and the amount of hostility and conflict between the Protestants and the Catholics was, to say the least, extreme. So much so that sometimes, on some occasions, if you backed the wrong horse or you said the wrong thing, you could actually end up with your head being removed. It was that serious, and there's countless tales and stories and well-known facts about some of the problems that composers had because they associated too much with Catholicism, or sometimes the other way around, but although less so. So, bearing in mind that Tallis definitely grew up in the first part of his life, the first half of his life coincided exactly with the reign of King Henry VIII, who, of course, set this problem into fruition, the whole business of breaking away from Rome and establishment of the Church of England, separate from the Catholic Church. So Tallis was very much used to that and grew up with it, I should say. And he also served under all the succession to Henry, Edward, Mary, who of course was definitely Catholic, and then lastly, Queen Elizabeth I. So Tallis had quite a close relationship with all of them, and indeed served all of those monarchs during his lifetime. Now, what effect does the problems of Catholicism and Protestantism have on the music? Well, firstly, also I should say perhaps in two ways. Firstly, the music, the style of the music, and secondly, the text. As far as the text is concerned, I'll take that one first. On the whole, not always, but on the whole, any Catholic church music of that period tends to be in Latin. Obvious reasons. Latin was the language of the Catholic Church. And the great advantage of that was, although it was even by then a dead language, the educated members of society could speak Latin, and it wouldn't make any difference whether you're in France, Spain, Italy, England, or anywhere else. The educated would understand very well Latin. So it was like a kind of universal language for those in the know. The other point, of course, is that in terms of religion and in terms of religious activities being relevant to the general population, it was thought after the Reformation that it would be much more suitable if all religious services, and therefore the music that was sung in those services, should be in the vernacular. In this case, it should be in English. And so composers were always striving to please whoever they thought was the most important influence, to write either exclusively in English or to write exclusively in Latin. And that was a constant battle for all of these composers, such as Tallis and Byrd and so on. And in terms of the music, the style of the music, that was just as important, because the tradition that had grown up not only on the continent with Palestrina and Josquin and Victoria and all those guys, not only there, but also in the early part of the 16th century in England, composers like Robert White and John Tavener, the old John Tavener that is, they were writing in a very elaborate, very complex style of polyphony, where often the music, the motets in particular, were scored of 5 or 6 parts, lots of weaving around, lots of what we would think of as counterpoint, lots of imitation, and very little occasion where you could really hear the words clearly. Now, to the Catholic Church, that didn't really matter because, as I say, most of the time they were performing in Latin. Everybody knew what the Latin text was, and they didn't have to worry about communicating the text. Everybody knew it already. If you knew you were listening to a setting of Ave Verum or whatever it happens to be, then you would assume everybody knew the text and everybody knew what it meant. So you didn't have to hear the words clearly. But once they started writing in English, and this was one of the commands of Luther and the other important elements of the Reformation, one of the things that they were insistent on is that the congregation should be able to hear and indeed understand the text all the time. And that's really difficult with these very florid compositions with lots of polyphony and lots of imitation and all that sort of thing. So the music had to be simplified, had fewer parts, had to have a much more homophonic texture where people sang, each part sang the text at the same time in pretty much the same rhythm. And many of you may be familiar with a very simple motet that Tallis wrote called If You Love Me, which is exactly that. It depicts very, very well the style of the new vernacular music that was designed to involve everybody, in particularly the congregation, so they could understand what was being sung and they could hear the words very clearly. So that was the kind of issues that composers were having to deal with the whole time, whether to write wonderful, rich, complex music, which was associated with the Catholic Church, or much simpler style, which was associated with the new Church of England. And Tallis, just like all his contemporaries, were kind of in the middle of this battle throughout their working lives. I mentioned the connection between William Byrd and Thomas Tallis, and it's certainly true that at the time, most composers, they wrote their music down, but it was very often not kept. So a complete manuscript of a work is quite a rare thing and very rarely found even today. What tended to happen was that the parts would be written in part books. So all the soprano parts, or cantus as they were called, they would have a book with various pieces in of just the cantus parts, just the soprano parts, and then you'd have another book with just the alto parts and another book with the tenor, and so on. So music existed, but it was obviously it had to be handwritten, and often was done very elaborately by monks and others, with lots of illustration and beautifully crafted. And the performers, the singers, they would crowd round a part book. They wouldn't have one each. They would crowd round it and sing from the part book. But it meant that there was no kind of copy of the whole score. The whole concept of a full score is very, very rare. And it wasn't until 1575 when Byrd and Tallis got together and they brought a selection of their pieces together and had it printed, published under the title Cantione Sacre. There were other versions of the Cantione Sacre which came a bit later, but this was the first time that they got together and made a kind of anthology, as we might think of it. And it's only because of that that a lot of these pieces survive. And I'm sure many got lost or have been lost, and we will probably never find them. Interestingly, Byrd and Tallis dedicated this book, this compilation, to the Queen Elizabeth I, in recognition of the fact that she had granted them a monopoly of printed music and music paper for their lifetime. And this may sound very odd, but of course, paper was incredibly scarce and very expensive. And let's face it, had lots of other uses. So the paper that was available, the parchment, a lot of it would be, was very, very precious and very rare. And so for a composer to actually be granted a monopoly of the supplies of manuscript paper is astonishing. Well, it's just, perfect for them. That's what they needed above everything else. So definitely it seems that Queen Elizabeth I was a fan both of Tallis and indeed of Byrd and their contemporaries. But quite what Queen Mary and quite what Edward thought of it, who knows? Perhaps somebody will tell me, but I'm not sure, to be honest. And coming round to Sperminalium, as I said, we know so little about this period, and we know so little about Thomas Tallis's life. It's no surprise that we don't know much about Sperminalium either. There have been lots of ideas put forward as to why this piece came into being, what it was for, what date it was performed, and so on. There are lots of theories. One of them is it was performed for Queen Elizabeth I's 40th birthday, which was in 1573. Whether that's true or not, who knows? There are other theories that it was commissioned by the Duke of Norfolk and first performed in a very large stately home in Surrey called Nonsuch, which happened to have large galleries, so a massive space, so you could have all the performers spread out, plus 3 large galleries. So you could have had maybe half the singer on the downstairs and another half the singers at the top, and utilizing the space, the spatial effect that you get from that kind of stereophonic version of a piece. So maybe that was true. Who knows? I don't know, and I don't think anybody really knows what brought this piece to fruition. But it seems likely that it was written around about 1570. So a mature piece, definitely, but not written right at the end of Tallis's life. And I think, just to put them into context, I often think of Tallis and Byrd being a bit like Vivaldi and Bach. So Byrd is the kind of king. He is the top man, the real god of that period, just as Bach is at the end of the Baroque period. But there's always got to be somebody before them who is a bit of a pioneer and creates some of the ideas and some of the structures and some of the inspiration for the Byrds and the Bachs to follow. Another example might be the relationship between Haydn and Beethoven, for instance. Haydn is the one, both great composers, obviously, but Haydn was the one responsible for creating or being often known as the father of the symphony and the whole establishment of sonata form and the string quartet and the sonata and all of those really important classical forms that were so crucial to the development of music in the 19th century. And then Beethoven comes along and sort of takes it all over and makes a massive statement with all these wonderful ideas that Haydn had but developed. And it's the same with Tallis and Byrd. So although they're contemporaries to some extent, as I said, Tallis is about 35 years older, and they did coincide. They were contemporaries, but one was much older than the other. Now, so all I can say is the piece exists. It is glorious. It's about 10 minutes long, maybe 12, something like that. And when you say to people, oh, yes, it's got 40 parts, and people think, well, how is that possible? There aren't 40 notes, let alone 40 notes that you can have in one chord. And of course, the answer is that at any one time, there will be lots of different voices singing the same note, but in a different context. So the harmonic language of this piece moves very, very slowly. It basically moves very graciously from one chord to another, and then sometimes to a third chord, and then back to where we started, and so on. So harmonically, it's very slow, but within that texture, there is an awful lot of movement. There's a heck of a lot going on, which produces an amazing variety of textures and sonorities, and indeed pitches as well. So how does he organize the 40 parts? Well, very simply, there are 8 choirs of 5 voices. So that's the important thing. Each choir has 5 voices, and there are 8 of them. And the important thing here is that because they're 5-voice choirs, it depends really what pitch you do it in. Originally, we think it was performed with more lower voices. So in this case, the cantus part, which is the soprano part, the alto part, the tenor part, and then 2 basses, a kind of baritone part and a low bass part. So every choir would have had divided basses and a single tenor, alto, soprano. But some people perform this piece up a tone, which works very well. And of course, one of the things that enables you to do is to move all the parts down a bit, because the music's gone up, the parts can come down. So this time we have divided sopranos, and then alto, tenor, and single bass line. And this has the advantage for modern choirs, obviously, who perhaps have more sopranos, certainly in this country, than they do basses. But I think for me, ideally, I would prefer to do it in its original pitch. Otherwise, it does get a bit squawky. And one of the things that is very clear about the 8 choirs is that the pitch of everyone is the same and the importance is the same. There is no question that soprano 1 is more important than soprano 8, or indeed that soprano 1 sings higher than soprano 8, because they don't. They're entirely equal. It really is an object lesson in equality. When you look at the score, everybody gets the same high pitch range and everybody has the same amount of very interesting material. It's just shared out at different times. So at one point you may have only choirs 1, 2, and 3 singing, and then another point you might have choirs 6, 7, and 8 singing, or you might have 3 and 4 on their own, or whatever. So there's lots of variety of texture, and then at certain points everything comes together in a massive, big scale. And that's what makes this piece so fascinating and so impressive, is that great variety of texture that you get from having so many forces to play with. It's also, I think, important to think in terms of how the voices are used. Basically, at this point of musical history, we are still thinking in terms of modes rather than keys. But having said that, the modal writing in this piece is very how we would think of being very major. Although it's transposed, it's basically Ionian mode, which is the C mode. So it sounds as if it's in a major key. But one of the things that distinguishes modality from tonality is that when you're working in a mode, you don't transpose, you don't modulate, rather. You can transpose the whole thing up or down, but you don't modulate. You stay where you are. And that's what gives this very kind of ethereal feeling of stability to the music. It doesn't feel as if it's disappearing off into a different place. It has variety and it has lots of texture changes and lots of dynamic changes according to how many people, how many voices are singing at any one part, any one time, but it doesn't modulate, it doesn't go off, whereas on any kind of different journey. Whereas once you got into the tonal system after 1600, then you can have, and indeed one of the strengths of music from there on was this ability to modulate from one key center to another. But here it's all very static. It's a bit like a very sort of traditional Gothic building. It stands there with all its glory and it's not going to move. It's granite. But within that, it has lots of florid decorations and beautiful carvings and other ways of distinguishing the individual bits of stone, or in this case, the individual lines of vocal material. But basically, it's still standing still in this very Gothic kind of feel. And the vocal parts themselves are sometimes quite complex, although the music sounds as if it's moving very, very slowly, and these slow chordal changes from one to the other. As I say, because of all the imitations going on, there's lots of rhythmic complexity, so that at any one time, one voice might be singing really quite complex rhythms with lots of dotted notes, lots of syncopation, and lots of quite complex scales, whilst other voice parts at the same time are just sustaining long notes. So you get a combination of these different patterns going on all the time. It's a bit similar, if you remember, to singing the Monteverdi Vespers of 1610. It's very similar to a movement like Nisi Domine, where Nisi dum da dum da dum ba dum ba dum ba dum bum da dum da dum, where you have all that very complex vocal writing, but very slow moving chordal patterns underpinning it, which just shows that when Monteverdi was writing that in 1610, it was quite an old-fashioned style. We're talking 40 years later with the Monteverdi. Of course, what Monteverdi also does is introduce all the new elements, all the virtuoso elements of the solo writing, the fact you've got instruments, the fact you've got basso continuo underneath it. All of that is all new, but some of the vocal styles in the Vespers, Monteverdi Vespers, are really quite similar to what Tallis is doing in the Sperminalium. And before I end, I just thought I would also just talk a little bit about the text, because the text is also slightly problematic. There are two versions, and in fact, there is a manuscript that has been passed down to us and is still in existence that dates from 1610, which is obviously after Tallis's death, where the music is very accurately portrayed. In other words, exactly the same music, but that somebody has got hold of it and rewritten a text. No surprise, it's in English, and it was dedicated to Henry, Prince of Wales, and it has these words: "Sing and glorify heaven's high majesty, author of this blessed harmony. Sound divine praises with melodious graces. This is the day, holy day, happy day. Forever give it greeting, love and joy, heart and voice meeting. Live Henry, princely and mighty. Harry, live in thy creation, happy." So this is just an opportunity to praise the Prince of Wales, pure sucking up music, basically. But it means that we don't really have much idea about the original text for the Sperminalium. We know what the text was, but we don't know how it relates to the notes. So we've had to kind of put it in as best we can. But the actual text of Sperminalium, I've got a translation here, and this I think is so appropriate for where we are at the moment. The first line, Sperminalium: "Hope in any other have I none. Hope in any other have I none. I have never placed my hope in any other than you, God of Israel, who can show both anger and graciousness and absolve all the sins of suffering man. Lord God, creator of heaven and earth, be mindful of our humility." So, very appropriate text for these times, I would say, and it works just beautifully. I won't play this piece to you because it will just sound horrible and distorted, but I do recommend you listen to it. There are versions on YouTube by the Tallis scholars, and there's one on Spotify also by the Tallis scholars. There's a live version on YouTube which has big choir where you can actually watch them doing it. Harry Christophers is directing it, but it's not the Tallis scholars. I think it's a choir from Holland or Netherlands or somewhere like that. Same place really, or Belgium, or I don't know. Anyway, I have seen it, and some time ago. So there are some good versions out there. Some are at the original pitch and some are tone higher, and you get to feel which is which and which you prefer. But I encourage you to have a listen, find the best recording you possibly can and the best equipment. Maybe headphones is a good idea to listen to it, because it is absolutely beautiful. And when it's well sung, it is just a stunning piece. And you'll hear all the individual voices, the sopranos in particular, they just follow each other, imitating each other. They all have these very quite high sustained notes they then give over to the next person and the next person, and so on. But from our point of view, when we perform it, I'm hoping to do it at the original pitch, so slightly lower, and we'll just have to do the best we can to find whatever it is. We need 24 tenors and basses to divide parts to be divided up amongst however many we've got. So there are, if you think about it, there are 16 bass parts, bass lines, and 8 tenor lines. So using a combination of tenors and basses, maybe some of the second tenors can do some of the first bass roles, and so on. We hopefully we can find enough singers to cover the 24 parts from the tenors and basses. It sounds terrifying, but they're not particularly difficult. Anybody who managed to find their way through the Monteverdi Vespers, they won't. It's certainly no more difficult than that. It's just a little bit thinned out, because obviously the number of singers on any one part is by definition going to be fewer when there are 40 of them. But it's an amazing thing to do. And personally, I can't wait to get my teeth into it and to have a chance to perform it, even if it's only for ourselves with you. So, as I say, my advice: find a good recording, quiet 10 minutes or 12 minutes, which is all it'll take, and just close your eyes and listen to the piece. And I think you'll find it really quite stunning if you haven't listened to it before or haven't done so for a while. Thomas Tallis, Speminalium. Thank you very much for listening, my loyal listeners, or perhaps I should say loyal listener. But anyway, either way, it's great to talk to you tonight, and I look forward to speaking to you again, and hopefully to actually seeing you live before not too long. Bye for now. Take care, and all the best to you.